All right, thank you everybody for attending this session, and thank you very much to Sylvia and the team for inviting me and Emma to present. I am going to be doing the speaking for this session, but Emma and I work very closely as a team to develop this presentation, but also on our day-to-day work at Laban, which is now Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Trinity Laban, I'll just give a brief introduction. We're based in southeast London, over near Deptford, in the Lewisham Borough, and we have an undergraduate in contemporary dance, so 3-year degree program in contemporary dance. We have approximately 300 students doing that program, and we have postgraduate programs as well, master's programs, Masters of Arts, Masters of Fine Arts, Masters in Dance Science, which is where I come in, and some PhD programs as well. And beyond that, we also have the Learning and Participation team that work with the community around the area and beyond of southeast London. So that's just a brief context of Laban and Trinity Laban. And the programs that I spoke about there were in the dance faculty as opposed to the music faculty, which is based in Greenwich. So I am here today to speak with you about dance science-informed teaching and training. My background is as a professional dancer, Irish dancer, and then retrained as a contemporary dancer, and discovered that I needed to learn a little bit more about how to take care of myself. And in learning that process, I stumbled upon the MSc in Dance Science at Trinity Laban and completed that 10 years ago. And since then have been very fortunate to stay on at Laban and work with dancers as a teacher and a trainer in that capacity. I'm now the program leader for the MSc in Dance Science, a master's program in Dance Science. And so my practice is very much informed by research. And today I'm going to share with you some of the ways in which we at Trinity Laban merge together research-informed practice. So research, doing of it, and adapting of that research into a practice-based scenario. So I'm just going to firstly tell you a little bit more about dance science at Laban, but I'll whiz through that, and then delve into a little bit of the literature that exists around circus and acrobatics. I am not an acrobatic performer, similar to James. I put that confession out there from the outset. Other than playing around in Greenwich Park with my friends from Full Stop Acrobatic Theatre who are based in Ghent, I have no experience whatsoever. But there is some literature out there, and I'd like to share that with you. I'll share with you screening, what screening means for us at Trinity Laban and how we do it, and then just delve into how we apply that into training practices and share with you maybe some opportunities for onward engagement. So we've just had to do a bit of a shift on my slides from my setting to the screen setting, so apologies, that's slightly gone off the screen. But at Laban with dance science stuff, we look at research, education, and consultancy. So we have sort of 3 different arms. I've spoken to you about the education, which is the MSc program. The research that we do focuses on things such as talent development, very mixed method approaches, and we also explore how best to train dancers from both a physiological, biomechanical, and also a psychological perspective. And we do some consultancy with companies, and in fact one of the first interactions we've had with the acrobatic world is through Mimbre back in 2009, who came to us to explore their training practices through some of our screening and research-informed mechanisms, and I'll share that with you as we go. These are just images of some of the dance science students in action. We have a lecture-based setting, a dance science lab, which can be quite a versatile space, not quite as large and as versatile as this space, I have to say. So we do different testing, both in the lab, but also very much in the practice-based studio setting. And we have various pieces of equipment that allow us to analyze what is going on within the body while it is working, moving, performing. The key tenets of dance science are very much about applying a research-informed knowledge into the application of the dancer. So it's not sufficient just to do research abstract from the application into movement and the performance arts. And to do so, we need to be cognizant of the physical, the psychological, but also the environmental. And I was very intrigued by the conversations about that. Performer was at Alice, who had restrictions in wrist range of motion, and then the adaptation of the environment when the adaptations within the body were not necessarily available to that person. So we need to consider the physiological, the psychological, and the environmental. And the ultimate aim is injury reduction, not injury exclusion completely. We're never going to eradicate injury entirely, but injury reduction. Performance enhancement, which maybe should come even before injury reduction, that we're aiming for the enhanced performance. And ultimately then longevity of participation, so trying to work with the body, mind, and environment in that way. Okay. In order to have a research-informed approach, which is what we attempt to do within dance science, we need to have an awareness of what the research is telling us. Now, not just the research out of textbooks, etc., but also the applied research that we're experiencing every day. Those things should come together. But I'm going to focus on the literature-based research because I don't have a first-hand embodied knowledge of the applied research that you guys are engaging in your training all the time. There is a scant level of literature based on this population. It's not very extensive. Actually, a quick search will easily tell you that. The research literature that is out there is predominantly based on injury. And that can sometimes have quite a negative connotation if it's just solely looking at where are the injuries rather than how might we best enhance performance, then that might have a negative connotation. However, of the literature that is available on acrobatics and circus arts, the injury rate is relatively low when looking at the amount of hours of exposure, so the amount of work that you guys are involved in on a daily basis. However, the severity of the injuries when they do occur can be much greater than they are in other activities. So the extent of the injuries, the severity of them can be higher, even if the rate of them per hours of exposure are relatively low. Schreer et al. In 2009 did a big study with Cirque du Soleil performers. It was across approximately 5 years. There was more than 3,000 performers and there was more than 18,000 injuries across that time. But they are suggesting that most of the injuries are relatively minor. But again, I am wondering if in practice we might perceive that to be different, and actually that many of the injuries you might see might be relatively severe. But what's interesting is many of the injuries were minor in that they were allowing people, they didn't sufficiently stop the performers from performing. And this is where we come into the problem then with the definition of what is injury. We can be injured, and as performing artists who are passionate about our art form, we generally tend to keep going. Sometimes inappropriately so, but we generally tend to keep going. And so classifying injuries as minor based on the fact that one kept going may be problematic. So just to put that out there. Just another thing on the relevant literature that is available of the circus arts. Acrobats are reported to be at a higher risk than some of the other circus arts. You may contest to that. You may have a reason, an explanation for that statement, but that is what the literature at the moment is suggesting. Most injuries are occurring in the lower limbs, knee, foot, and ankle, some in the lumbar spine. And a note to say actually that the cervical spine is an area that 1 in 5 work-related injuries of the Schreer study are occurring in the cervical spine. So this is an area that we need to pay particular attention to. There does seem to be a difference in injury pattern between working with equipment and working without equipment. where working with equipment, the locations of the injury are different, as well as the rate of injury. And that we're finding a pattern. So the last point here is that most injuries seem to occur during the training rather than during the performance itself. So that gives you a picture of what the literature-based research is telling us, but it may support or indeed conflict with what your experiential knowledge is telling us. Yes?
The study of the Cirque du Soleil one. Can you get a microphone, please?
Oh yeah, we need it for the... So when you speak, we do need a microphone so that it will be captured on the camera. Thank you.
It's just in it. Yeah. In addition to that was the people who were training and injuring themselves. It was training before lunch, training at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we need to bear in mind that when we read literature about, it's a snapshot of what was found, and it can often be quite reductive in terms of taking something and looking at it within a small context as opposed to the broader context. However, that in itself can absolutely still feed in and contribute to our knowledge and way of knowing in terms of training. But very, very valid point. Thank you. Just because dance is my most comfortable area of research and practice, I was thinking about this literature that I was reading in relation to the acrobats and circus arts. And relative to dance, there seems to be relatively low rate of injury. Again, the severity is large. In dance, we see up to 80% of any given, sometimes some literature is actually saying even 92% of dancers in a 1 year period are suffering from injury. So relatively speaking, injury rate is low. There seems to be similar areas of the body. Oh, sorry, yes, we need a mic.
I'm just wondering if some of the research is also biased based on a person's, based on being informed about whether or not someone is injured. Because I know lots of circus performers who hurt themselves constantly and just don't mention it.
Exactly that, yeah. And I think that's a problem in all research in general is how injury is defined in the first place. So often injury is defined as time lost due to an injury, and actually a lot of us just keep going, so then that's not captured in the data. And similarly, if someone doesn't report an injury, or actually we're so used to aches and pains in our own experience of training that we don't consider it an injury, even though potentially it might be or might contribute to an injury down the line. So absolutely right, the data itself can be flawed. And again, the extent of literature that's available in acrobats and circus arts is so limited that we're looking at a very small population in a very small window. And actually, that's why conferences such as this are essential to really begin to get the bigger picture and move our understanding forward. The issues in relation to definition within the research is what I've just mentioned, and we have that problem in our dance research also. But if we were to interpret that literature with a low injury rate in acrobatics, we would be interpreting it to say that actually something is working well within acrobatic training and circus arts training, as opposed to something that may not be working quite so well within dance training, for example. We could interpret it that way. So if something is working within the acrobatic and circus arts training that's effective, that's not resulting in 80% of injuries, as is the reported rate within dance practice, then what is it? Is it the specificity of the training? Is it that, as was mentioned previously, you kind of explore everything and then you find what fits for you, I think was the word that was used before, and then you can specialize in that area. So maybe there's a way of selecting, self-selecting more healthful approaches to your training within circus arts and acrobatics than there is perhaps within dance practice. And I should say, this is not about comparing dance to acrobats. I'm just trying to, for me to make a connection between my area of knowledge and the group that I'm sharing with today. Is it that there's a combination of physical training and artistic practice? I certainly know within dance, when we're just focusing on dance, the technique class is expected to take up both the artistry, the skill and the coordination of the art of the dance style, and some of the physical training. My understanding within acrobatics is that the physical training can happen slightly separate to the artistic training, and at some point they come together, but that there can be a much clearer delineation of those processes than there is within dance practice. And maybe there's an appreciation of the inherent risks. You know, we know if we're going to hang ourselves off the ceiling or fly ourselves through the air, that there's an inherent risk in that. So maybe already we're asking, as the Circus Arts and the acrobatics are asking, how might we most safely and effectively train for that risk? Perhaps us dancers are not asking those same questions. But maybe there are still things that can be put in place for improvements. And these are some of the ways in which, in the dance world, and certainly at Trinity Laban, that we have taken literature and research and our applied knowledge and expertise and tried to put some practices together in order to enhance performance and reduce injury risk. And screening is one of them, and I'm going to focus on that. I need to make it very clear, when we refer to screening, it's not about screening people out. It's actually, we take them onto the program, and then we conduct a series of screenings, multifactorial screenings, multidisciplinary screenings. And it's about identifying where potential weaknesses might lie. And again, I say potential weaknesses because we actually don't know what true injury risks are. We don't know whether that hyperextended elbow and restricted range of motion at the wrist is going to absolutely result in an injury. We can never truly know that. So we're just using our awareness of what might potentially be a weakness and therefore might potentially result in an injury down the line. And if we can identify that from the outset, how might we best work with that? And I say work with it rather than against it. Also, with screening, it is not just about identifying the weaknesses, but very much about identifying what is working, what is effective, and how might that be maintained. So not just focusing on the areas of limitations, but focusing on the areas that are aiding progression. This is quite a busy slide, but just to say that the International Association for Dance, Medicine and Science, which is the Dance Science international body, they have produced a screening in a dance wellness program resource paper, which is freely available on the IADM's website, and I can send contacts around later if anyone is interested. And they're suggesting that there should be various different components to a screen and that different professionals should feed into that. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we all had access to every single one of these professionals at the tip of our fingertips? But the fact is we don't. They're also suggesting that qualitative and quantitative data should be gathered, so it's not just about the numbers and the reductionist and the quantifiable, but it's also about the quality. And I think that was also, for me, referred to earlier on this morning. It's not just about the range of motion available at one joint, but how that interacts in the full body movement that we're asking our performers to do. So the screening and profiling that we provide at Trinity Laban is initially for our undergraduate students. Once they've been auditioned and accepted onto the program, there is a screening facility available to them. And I'll walk and talk you through what that is so that there's a bit more clarity about it. But we also have a screening program that is available to independent dance artists and performing artists, and that would include anyone in this room. And we offer that externally to the internal program that we offer to our students. The aims of our screening is to observe any health factors that are relating to training, so things like menstrual health patterns for the females, sleep, which can be an important factor in training and recovery processes, and general health and well-being. So that's via a questionnaire and a one-to-one conversation. We also are assessing potential for injury risk based on what we know about musculoskeletal functioning. And the aim is actually to inform and empower dancers. So it's to give the dancers an extra way of knowing. And again, I think Lena mentioned earlier on that it's not solely about identifying weaknesses, but it's about knowing what is going on so that you can have an empowerment over taking that possibility forward. So we have an interdisciplinary perspective. We look at biomechanics, physiology, and some well-being attributes. And the idea is that we're feeding all this knowledge and information into informing the training and optimizing the performance potential of that individual dancer or group of dancers. So what do the dancers experience? They get about 60 minutes one-to-one musculoskeletal and fitness assessments. And here are just a few images of those assessments that they experience. So we do look at body mass index and body composition in order to assess for healthy ranges. Certainly within the dance population, it's very common for some dancers to be at the low end of body composition recommendations, and so we need to be able to mediate against that. And we do a series of flexibility and range of motion assessments, and we also look at whether one would be classified as clinically hypermobile. So we may have excessive range of motions at our joints, but they may not fall into the category of clinically hypermobile. So we do a range of those assessments. We also do some functional fitness assessments, such as a maximum jump height to represent lower limb power in the lower legs, and also the repetitive jump test, which gives an indication of fatigue across time at a high intensity endurance measure. We do plank and press-up tests as well. There is also then a 30-minute physiotherapist functional assessment, where the physiotherapist will do a range of clinical functional assessments. This is Tanya Amarin, our resident physiotherapist at Laban. And there's the opportunity for a studio-based dance-specific fitness test. So again, taking it out of the lab, out of the microscopic range of motion at one joint and into the functional movement in the studio. Or a treadmill-based test, which is looking at oxygen uptake and aerobic capacity. So the studio-based tests, they allow us to look more specifically at the demands of dance activity and the intensity that the dancers are performing at, and that happens in the studio. And those dance-specific tests have been developed by Emma Redding and colleagues at Laban, so by dancers, for dancers. We can also, you may recognize, who is that? Who was that? Emma. There's Emma on the treadmill. So we can also do lab-based tests, and those two the type of testing combined can help us to inform the dancer a little bit more about themselves. And these standardized measures that are based in the lab can also help us see where on a scale of normal population or athletic population or dance population that performer might sit. Although it's important to say that it's not always about comparing to others. It is very much then about how that dancer, that performer, can progress across time. So we spend a good 10, maybe 15, sometimes 20 minutes giving individual feedback to that dancer about the things that we have witnessed and seen. Within our undergraduate population, it's very important for us to explain to that dancer that this is just one way of looking. It's one way of observing where they're at and what they're doing. And actually, throughout their training on a day-to-day basis, they'll get other ways of looking via their technique teachers and their choreography teachers and their contextual studies teachers, etc. So there will be other ways, but this is one way in which they can understand and know a little bit more about themselves. We also have a dancer wellness program. It's an online interactive screening program that is available globally. It's actually generated by Gary Galbraith, who's an ex-dancer with Martha Graham's company, and he's based in Ohio State University, and he has devised this online program which all our dancers get a login to, and then they can access their information at any time point, and they can also access information about the anatomy, about certain body parts. They can access information about certain exercises that the physiotherapist might have recommended that they pursue, and so it becomes an interactive way of working and taking the information away. I mentioned before that we also do bespoke packages, so we were in a fortunate position in 2009 when Sylvia and Lena and Emma first came to us and said, we know you do screenings and we're curious, and can we engage with this practice as a way of helping to progress our training and understanding of what we're doing. And so we did that in 2009 with Mimbre, and again in 11-12. And we've also worked with other professional dance companies. And it's very much important in those situations to have an initial consultation with the individual organization or company to know what the aims and objectives are for the screening process. And I mentioned that it's also open, the screening is open to non-Trinity Laban students. And so through our membership with the National Institute for Dance, Medicine and Science, and through our connections with Dance UK, we are one of 2 centres offering screening within the performance optimisation package. So this is something that Dance UK are offering, and so within that, in any 1 year, a performer who's a member of the performance optimisation package can get 2 musculoskeletal and fitness screens, either at Birmingham, up in Birmingham at the Jerwood Centre, attached to Birmingham Royal Ballet, or in London at Trinity Laban with us. And there's also a tailored Cash for Health plan within that as well. So just in case people were not aware of that. What the people who have, the dancers and performers who have come to our screening, these are the sorts of things they value from the experience. They value knowing more about themselves. They value having targeted areas for which they can pursue in their training. So I hope that gives a little insight into what screening means for us at Trinity Laban. We can also take that information, the information of the individuals, and group it together, and it has actually helped us to inform how we have changed our curriculum across time. So for example, many years ago, about 10 years ago now, we understood that our dancers were not effectively progressing in their cardiovascular fitness capacity. So their stamina was poor, basically, had not improved across the 3 years of their training. And so with that knowledge and information, we were able to take out one of their technique classes on their program and put in a dance-specific fitness class, and then again monitor the effectiveness of that. And more recently, we've actually managed to, we're not offering that fitness class anymore for various reasons, but we are now providing an educative program, which I'll just share with you in a moment. With the information from the screening, we can then make amendments and adjustments to training. And again, I'm just going to do a very quick talk through some training ideas and principles and how we apply them in dance. According to one of the Acrobat studies, and again, you can critique this as those who are experiencing this training, I'd like to focus maybe on this bottom point, the suggestion that without a sufficient aerobic base, that there is a potential for increased injury risk when performing demanding activities. For me, this resonated with what we were uncovering with the dancers, in that they may be strong, they may be flexible, they may have sufficient levels of power, but if they're missing an underlying aerobic base, then that can be problematic for being able to withstand the training sessions, the 90-minute class, 3 of them in one day, followed by rehearsal, followed by performance. So there's something about that underlying aerobic space that might be also perhaps lacking or limited within the aerobic population, the acrobatic population. And so these are the various components of physical activity. And I know within a dance technique class, the emphasis is here. And so the other elements tend to be byproducts of the focus on this, rather than allowing for any particular focus on the other areas, which means that in dance practice, we absolutely have to recommend supplemental fitness training. So specific training sessions that focus on the other areas so as to support the skill and coordination and skill learning that happens in the technique class. I throw over to you who are experiencing your acrobatics and circus arts training. Where would you say the balance lies in your training and practice within each of these areas? And is there any one area that you think, either for yourself or for the groups that you're working with, might be limited? Where do you focus your efforts, or do you think it is shared across each of those areas? It's shared?
Same as dance.
Same as dance, you think? Okay.
Personally, I rest a lot more than I do any of the other things.
Okay, so you have plenty of rest, so we have some rest, and other people think it's similar to dance.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh yeah,
thank
there we
you.
go. I've trained in both dance and gymnastics. Become both a professional dancer and circus performer. I would say that with dance training, all your strength comes from the dance technique itself, whereas in gymnastics you have a conditioning program. And this comes back to what Will was saying yesterday about having different things to get your strength, get your flexibility. And I feel that I suffered a lot less injuries in dance, but only because of the conditioning I did in gymnastics.
Right, okay. That would sort of make sense in my head, actually, because I think what we are lacking in dance quite a lot is an awareness of that supplemental training. It's changing, times are changing, and we are embracing it much more, and I think that's something that certainly dance training could borrow from acrobat training. Yes.
Sorry, thanks. I think it depends on the discipline,
Right.
myself.
Yeah.
And not just the discipline, but the year that you're in. Because in your final year here, you tend to concentrate a little bit more on the students putting a sequence of moves together to have their end device piece. So it changes with the needs of where they're at in their training. And yes, really specifically changes with the discipline they're doing.
Okay. Sylvia?
Yeah, I'd also would say that once you come out of your student years, once you become professional, you would only typically concentrate on your skill at the cost of, keep developing or looking at other things, because you have to work, you have to train, you have to probably a lot of the time you run your own company, or you're self-employed. So obviously a lot of that, which ties in with what we discussed yesterday as well, we need to address, because it's something that for sure we are generally, I think we are lacking.
Okay, and one more? Yeah.
It's a question.
Go
Is
for
that
it.
okay?
Yeah.
I was wondering how you recommend working on cardiovascular endurance if running or, running, swimming, if it's relevant because it's cardiovascular, or if it's, because for me when I do a dance class, I get tired in a totally different way to how I do if I'm running or,
Okay, so there are fundamental physiological training principles in terms of how to access and target our cardiovascular system or our aerobic energy systems, and it's to do with being in a certain zone of your percentage heart rate, and I'm not going to go into that now, but what we find often with the dancers actually is that they don't have necessarily the money to go join a gym. They don't particularly like running on a treadmill, and sometimes if you haven't run previously and you don't have efficient biomechanics for running, it can actually impact upon some of the health and well-being of the body. So there are other ways in which you can cardiovascularly train, and through Emma, myself and Sonia Rafferty, our colleague at Laban, we have developed a dance-specific fitness program, and so the movements that we do within that program start quite functional, actually, more like your classic aerobics, maybe a 1980s aerobics class, possibly with some grapevines and some knee lifts, but actually transition relatively quickly into more dance-specific movement material. And we don't have any videos of that. I'm looking to Emma. We've no way of sharing it. But Sonia and Emma did share it at a strength and conditioning conference just on Friday that was organised by Dance UK. And so I think there are ways in which you can engage in training your cardiovascular system that can be within your discipline. If you can understand the underlying principles of how to go about it, then you can adapt it across. And I'll touch upon some of those underlying disciplines just now, but also refer you to a couple of key documents. I just noticed Hester's hand went up.
Just to really quickly put in there that I'm one of the students that trained at Laban as well. I was the first cohort, I think, that had the fitness class.
Was it that long
10
ago? Yeah.
years
10
ago,
years ago,
11
yeah.
years ago.
Yeah.
So when I left Laban, I actually chose between going here and Laban. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do first, but I did a dance training. And when I did my aerial training, I was doing fitness classes for the people on my foundation course before we started the day. And then I took what I was learning and took it to the gym where I worked and created something, which is what I do now, which is Circus Fit. And it is a cardiovascular training. It's anaerobic plus aerobic plus strength plus endurance plus explosive exercises plus stretching. So that was my interest, like how can we make this also very accessible for people, and from beginning level up, how can we safely take them onto equipment which is kind of dangerous. So
I think the key
maybe we could do something here.
The key thing as well about cardiovascular is the durational element, and it's if you really just want to target the aerobic system, you don't want to go to high intensity. And eventually you can do you can alternate it between high intensity, medium intensity, low intensity, but you want to be in the moderate intensity zone. So you don't want to be at your maximum, you want to be in moderate intensity from your maximum heart rate. There is a resource paper from IADAMS, the International Association for Dance Medicine and Science. It's free, again written by Emma and Sonia. I can give you that link up afterwards. And there's also the FEDEC document, which I have, which I'm about to come to. I'm just going to move on from that and see if some of these things are resonating with you also. This is a graph of one dancer's heart rate taught by the same teacher, but the red line is the contemporary dance class, following the sort of standardized structure of a contemporary dance class, so focusing on skill learning, development and technique. And the blue or purple line is the dance-specific fitness class that same teacher then delivered to that same dancer. And so what you can see in terms of the peaks and troughs of the heart rate is that the intensity of the dance-specific fitness class is at a higher level. And so it's actually accessing a different heart rate zone for that individual dancer. And it's taking them closer towards their maximum for longer periods of time than the dance class is, which is a little bit more intermittent stop-start. And that's very purposeful because the technique class needs to be stop-start in order to provide the technical feedback and the correction and the skill learning and the skill development. And so what if the dance-specific fitness class does is take away some of that high-level skill learning, but allows for the intensity of movement and performance to be sustained for longer periods of time, and therefore allowing the heart rate to also be sustained for longer periods of time. And that can help to train then the aerobic base. But it is difficult to do the two things at once. It's difficult to train the technique skills within the technique class and also target the aerobic capacity. So within dance, what we're learning is that we need to actually have separate sessions for those things, and maybe that's something that intuitively happens within the circus arts and the acrobats. Yes, Yumi. You need the mic so that it can be picked up. Yeah.
Is the x-axis minutes?
The x-axis, yes, was time, duration.
That's pretty impressive time spent on the high heart rate.
From here?
On the purple, yeah.
All the
like
way.
at the top, yeah,
Yeah.
that's really impressive.
How old is the person?
How old were they, Emma? 20, early 20s.
So this is an example of one dancer, the same dancer doing the contemporary and the fitness class.
fitness class had a big chunk.
You need the mic, Emma.
Sorry. The fitness class had a large chunk of time which was spent in the sort of aerobic zone, although her heart rate is pretty high.
Her heart rate is quite
as
high
you've
for that,
commented
yeah.
there. But essentially she did keep up, so that probably wasn't her maximum because she was able to keep up for sort of 15, 20, 30 minutes or so. Then it kind of dipped a little bit, and then she went back up. So, but it's the same student. It's just an example of one student who did the 2 classes, which is quite interesting to see.
Just to give you a reference point, why that's impressive to me is that the fittest woman on earth 2 times, her maximum heart rate, of course she's a little bit older maybe than this athlete, but she cannot get to that heart rate and certainly cannot sustain it there. So the heart rate is not a measure of fitness, but that's a very impressive graph of being able to be there that long.
I don't think she was even a particularly elite dancer, to be honest. Yeah. But she was younger as well. Yeah, she was around 20. So, there are some key things to bear in mind if you're looking to target any of the areas on this graph. And those are the training principles that exist for any physiological training. Things like overload, which is a positive thing. Overload allows for progression and adaptation of training. Overwork is a negative thing. Unfortunately, the words are quite similar, but the principles behind them are different. So overload is important in order to be able to progress. Specificity, reversibility. I'm not going to give a lecture on training principles, but just to point out that keeping those things, having an awareness of these training principles when devising training programs is important. But what is almost more important is maintaining a balance between rest and activity, because often we are, as performing artists, culprits of do, quantity, quantity, quantity. And actually what we need to bear in mind is that it's about the quality of the training that is most important rather than the quantity. And I may be preaching to the converted here, but you never know. I did notice that is there someone later on speaking on rest and recovery? Yeah. So I will quickly go through. So if there's an inappropriate training load and insufficient rest and recovery, the body is at a greater risk of fatigue and increased injury risk and possible underperformance. So getting that balance right can be really key. On the flip side, if there's an appropriate training load, if there's sufficient time for rest and recovery, then actually there's a decreased likelihood of injury risk and an increased likelihood of optimizing performance potential. So how do we go about trying to train more wisely? And these are the things that we're always asking ourselves at Laban, and we're in the process of actually looking at our entire 3-year training program and seeing how it might be developed in order to give the right things a rest period at the right time. It's going to be a long journey for us, but we're really trying to take the research knowledge and expertise and bring it right back into practice, not just theoretically, but in reality. It's important maybe to point out that rest can mean many things. And if we're talking about rest for recovery purposes, then it can have a slightly different interpretation. Often when I ask my students, what does rest mean? They tend to say sleeping. And yes, you are hopefully resting while you're sleeping, but there are also different variations of rest. So you can have complete rest, stopping the activity, or active rest, where you can actually be diversifying the activity. And some of us may have experienced that ourselves, sometimes even just going and doing a yoga class when we've been doing ballet technique all week can be a way of us somehow feeling rested, for example. So sometimes diversifying the activity or reducing the intensity of the activity can contribute towards rest. It's important also that rest, even though it was on the components of physical activity, and we had one confession of actually resting quite well, thank you, the importance with rest is that it's not just a physical attribute. It very much is about looking after the mental element as well, because we need to be able to rest both mind and body. And so there are ways in which we can incorporate some psychological strategies that can help us to engage with training, but also through rest. Of course, good nutrition and hydration are also important to support healthful training and rest. And we need to think about carefully planned, distributed practice, and that should be prioritized. And there is a method within athletics and physical training called periodization, and that's where you're using a systematic planning. I'm not sure why it keeps doing that, but okay. And so there are some quick tips in order to be able to introduce rest, so reducing training load prior to a performance. And I'm not sure what it's like in your world, but certainly in our dance world, choreographic pieces tend to be changed even an hour before the performance actually goes on stage. And so the build-up to the performance is like this, as opposed to allowing some time for a dip. I mentioned being able to use psychological skills and mental rest. Actually using mental practice as part of the rehearsal schedule can also be really important. So taking time away from maybe working physically on the apparatus or physically on the movement material, but doing it mentally through visualization and mental rehearsal can be a way to best effectively use your rehearsal time without it always being physical. And then to make sure that scheduling rest and recovery becomes part of the schedule. The training schedule includes rest and recovery periods, which then places emphasis and importance on them, and therefore there's a value to that element, rather than maybe performers feeling that we're being lazy by actively incorporating rest. So I just would like to refer you to a specific resource, and that is the instruction manual, the FEDEC instruction manual, chapter 1, Theory, Guidance and Good Practice on Training Acrobats. It's freely available on the internet, which is great, and it goes into all the underlying training principles that I addressed. Are there people here who actually were involved in writing that? James, yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so please go and source that, it's great. Just before I wrap up, I'd like to just take a note on psychological well-being, because I think as physical artists we tend to focus our efforts quite often on the physical body, on the physical training, but we need to just be as mindful about the psychological well-being. So just briefly, a positive psychological environment is important to ensure safe psychological and emotional practice. And it's actually in the research, again, we're learning that the dance teachers, the dance coaches, the dance leaders, and the trainers and the athletic coaches, etc., are actually the people that can influence the learning environment, the psychological learning environment, more than any other person within that experience. And so we know that there are psychological variables that are also associated with ill-being and injury. And we speak again a lot about the physiological and biomechanical risks, but there are also some psychological risks. And so overexposure to negative learning environments can exacerbate some of those psychological risk factors. And so if we can have a more positive psychological learning environment, then we can actually counteract some of those negative implications. And so the idea is that a task involving learning environment, so a learning environment that realizes that mistakes are part of learning, that is a self-referenced learning experience as opposed to referring to others. So I want to be better than you, rather than I would like to better myself, and how do I go about bettering myself, is what is suggested as being the most beneficial. And if that is a task involving learning environment, then it is said to be promoting autonomy within the performer, so a sense of ownership and volition over what they're doing, relatedness, a connection to the people that they're doing it with, and to the art and performance itself, and a sense of competency, so a sense of being able to achieve, a sense of being competent at what they're doing, and competent to be able to progress. And these are considered the basic psychological needs, or they're also termed the healthful motivational building blocks, so having building blocks to maintain motivation in one's practice. And there are some strategies that we can employ that can help feed right back into this system. And they are goal setting, self-talk, imagery, and relaxation. And I'm sure there are others, but those are the main four. And of course, feedback becomes a compounding factor. So how we as trainers and teachers and educators are providing feedback to our dancers and performers can also influence the perception of the learning environment. So that was a quick whistle-stop tour of the psych elements. Just within the first year program, we at Laban, we have tried to take all this research and knowledge and applied practice expertise to develop a compulsory first year module that looks at all these different areas. And so we try to address the mind, body, some psychological skills, some anatomical knowledge and understanding, some awareness of physical fitness training. We involve mind-body practices, so Feldenkrais as a mind-body practice, and yoga, and we discuss how they might be relevant for some but not others, and how they all feed in to trying to take ownership over individuals' performance. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip to this one. The key thing, and I think this for me resonates with some of what James was saying at the end of his session, is that there needs to be an interplay between the research information, the research-informed recommendations, the stylistic or choreographic requirements perhaps of each individual discipline within the acrobats, but also each different technique within dance practice, and the individual physiological and psychological variations that we're dealing with. And we need to look to all of those and find the best, safe, effective meeting point. And that might be in a slightly different place in the picture for everyone in this room. So in summary, the literature is telling us something that we may or may not agree with, but that the injury rate in acrobatics is relatively low, but that there might be a need for a readdressing of balance in training. That aerobic underlying capacity was what was raised. Screening and profiling can be a means of supporting and directing healthy training regimes. Consideration of training schedules in relation to all the components of physical fitness and physical activity. Not just the artistic needs of the performance, so also thinking about the physical principles underlying it. A consideration of healthful psychological learning environments is also important to optimize training and reducing injury risk. And research-informed education for teachers, coaches, and performers can be essential to actually helping us to achieve where we're hoping to get to with healthy performers. This specific population is under-researched, and so we kind of need to do more to know about what's going on with this population and how we might even share best practice to other populations of performing artists. Many ways in which you can engage with this stuff. These are predominantly dance-specific, because again, that's my area of expertise, but there's also the publications via the FEDEC website. And that is it. I hope I've left enough of time for further questions and comments. I'm not sure I have.
5 minutes.
Sorry.
It started late anyway. Yeah. Who's got the microphone? Thank you very much.
Hi, just going back to the cardiovascular point. When I was working with Kanduko Dance Company, I realized that it was really difficult for me to get my heart rate up in comparison to the other dancers in the room who were not using a wheelchair. And though my data point is really small because it's all the other dancers I know who are in wheelchairs, and that's not very many, every one of them I spoke to had exactly the same problem with cardiovascular fitness. Have you got any suggestions, or have you got any experience working with people with disabilities to find a way to enable them to increase that cardiovascular fitness appropriately?
I personally do not have any direct experience. No, I don't. Are you confined to a wheelchair? I see you're not. You're
I
sitting
sit in a chair and I sleep in a bed.
Okay. So, but you can use your arms in order to wheel the chair, to mobilize, and that in itself will raise the heart rate within the training zone that is needed. It might be that you need to do it for longer durations. It might be that you need to really think about other ways. So it's often also changing the orientation of the torso to the rest of the limbs. So simple things like this will also increase so leaning forward, coming back, adding in reaches, and then also pushing the chair will increase the heart rate to the extent that you can work within the training zone that is recommended for cardiovascular training. But I'd
well,
love
that's
to.
helpful, thank you.
I'd love to
Adele,
try.
can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So I think the main thing, as Adele said, is to find your way of raising your heart rate.
Yeah.
Heart rates are increased when you use big major muscle groups. Now, that's often the legs. So if it's not the legs, then it's going to have to be the arms above the heart. If you take the arms above the heart, that increases the heart rate more. And it's doing that repetitively. So it's about doing movements repeatedly for a continuous period of time and using big major muscle groups. But the other point to add, I think, is that for you, if it's okay for your heart rate to be lower than somebody else, it's about you achieving what you can do with your body, and to try and look at the kinds of performance demands that you're being asked to meet that might be different. So it's not about comparing your heart rate to somebody else's, but what are the demands that are being asked of you, and how can you best meet those as well?
Awesome. I'll look into this more.
Thank you.
Hi. I have signed up to Dance UK's pop screening program, and I've had my first screening and got the next one next month. But what I'm interested in knowing is, because you were talking about how it works within the degree program and the support that you have along with the physiotherapists, how that can be transferred to, say, like a freelance performer who has quite an erratic performance schedule and training schedule, who basically transitions through different stages over a period of time. So the first question is, what kind of support is there in addition to having the screening? So once you've got the screening and you know there's things that you need to work on, I've kind of been given like a program, but I don't have like a physiotherapist and osteo within the program. I've had to go outside of it. And the second one is, I guess, as a freelancer, obviously my kind of baseline is changing because of my activity.
Yeah. So in response to your first question, that there isn't anything in place at the moment for that interim period. And I say at the moment because we're aware of that, and actually Dance UK are in the process of having various discussions with various organisations about how we might put something in workshops or educational sessions about, again, handing over some of that information about those training principles and training mechanisms to the independent artists so that they're able to take it on themselves. So at the moment, unfortunately, there is nothing, but we're aware of that, I think, and we're hoping to address that. The second question was...
The baseline.
Yes,
the changing baseline, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, this is why having a one-to-one, putting the feedback in context, so not just giving the report, and giving the data and going, this was your score last time, this is your score now. It's actually having a look at what that means, what that represents in reality. We have had one POP member come back recently, and they've changed from being much more parkour orientated to actually being in a contemporary dance company. And that information was very important when we fed back the results, because you could see the changes in lower limb power versus upper body strength and endurance, and actually that was represented within the data. And so that knowledge and information was really important to contextualize what we were seeing. And I think you're right, the independent dance artist in particular, or performing artist, has such variability that it's a whole other population than the Trinity Laban controlled 3 years, we know exactly what they're doing, training experience. The POP is new, the performance optimization package is new, so we're learning how to adapt our knowledge and expertise to a broader range of people and performers. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the injury rate comparison you did at the beginning.
Yeah.
If you could go back to it.
So this was in the published literature? Is that?
Yeah, I was wondering if you were comparing like professional artists from Cirque du Soleil with students from Trinity Laban.
Okay, so let me be clear. I haven't done any of this research, so I haven't actually been able to compare the data. What we know from the dance literature is that between 80 to 92% of dancers in any 1 year are reporting injuries. And relatively speaking, what's appearing in the Circus Arts and acrobatics literature is a lower rate. It's not directly comparable because we're looking at rate in relation to hours of exposure within the aerobics, within the acrobatic group, and within dance we're just looking at percentage of reporting. So it's not directly comparable.
Okay, it's just because I know the injury rate between students, dance students and professionals is very different. So I guess if we will have the data from the circus students, maybe the injury rate will be much higher than the professionals.
That's an interesting question. So yeah, you think that those in training would have a higher injury rate than those within the profession?
I expect so.
I would imagine. Go for it.
So the first study was NICA, so the school in Australia. That was the first study, and that was the where you get injured before lunch and at the end of the day, and the other was Cirque du Soleil.
And I was just going to add, it feels to me that the gymnastic world is missing from this debate.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
And the research is there. I mean, surely we should be comparing with the gymnast should be a third party in this.
Yeah,
discussion.
Absolutely. I haven't brought any gymnastic literature or research to the presentation today, but that's a really valid point.
This is an area that I'm actually researching into at the moment as part of my master's and my PhD. And I'm doing a cross comparison of breakdancers with acrobats and circus as well. But the big problem with the literature that's out there is minimal, as in the circus world. There's a large bias as well. People don't want to be seen as injured. They don't want to be seen as weak. They feel that by doing that, they've lost a part of them. They've lost a part of them in sort of an economic and commercial value. Equally, if you compare the literature, you can apply to Cirque du Soleil and they will give you access to their records. But their records are based on people going to them and recording what they see as an injury. But the problem with that is they're not going to put down everything, because there's also a big tendency in the breakdancing world as well, and the cross-section with circus of, we're strong, we have a high pain threshold, it's just a burn, it's just a bruise, let's ignore it. So the data is flawed, which is what you did say.
Very much so.
And there are people out there who reckon, and from breakdancing there are some absolutely horrendous injuries, but they'll carry on in braces and carry on performing and say, no, I'm not injured, I need a slight tweak in my spine, and yet they're wearing a back brace. So it's massively flawed. It's a very, very interesting area and a very popular area, so hopefully we can develop this.
Thank you.
Somebody's already talked about the sort of freelancer challenge, but I'd love to know, I don't know if there is something today specifically about this, but I'd love to know how people recommend maintaining training when you're doing like maybe 4 totally different jobs at once, or when you're on tour and then coming back and you've got just admin to do for a month and trying to do a bit of training, or like, my days, my weeks, my months vary so hugely, like what the training program might be that could be maintained, or what minimum requirements are, that kind of thing.
Just following on from that, I thought maybe I'll say over lunch I'm going to just come and talk to people individually about things that we can implement in terms of the wider industry out there, like what kind of measures can we put in place, how can we explain to venues better about the needs of circus performers, that they can't just walk on stage and do a show, and they need warm-up time and warm-up spaces and all those kind of things, and how we can improve the kind of broader industry working practice. Because I think in a school, like obviously you're really aware of the needs of the performers, but you go out there and a lot of other people aren't, and they're they quite to the contrary sometimes, unfortunately. So
and I think that's really important as well, to have the liaise with that venue to actually prioritize those things and say, no, we need a space for warm-up, cool down. We need to know where the eateries are around the area. And often it's left at least within dance, it's left to the performer often to figure those things out. Yeah. Whereas if it comes from the director or the company manager or the person that's directly liaising with the venues, if there is that person in place, then again, that places a real importance for the performing artist on those things. And it just means that we're all speaking from the same page. Yeah.
And the other thing I just wanted to say, I thought it was really interesting, all your research into the kind of psychological side of training, and I wondered like how much we can make connections there with social circus training, like community training as well, where all those psychological and social factors are kind of play a bigger role. So it's really interesting to kind of broaden that conversation with that in mind as well.
Thank you.
One more question and then we have to break for lunch.
Just to follow on, I think that Dance UK did something amazing when they did this massive survey and they found out what the conditions of company training spaces were and theatres were, and they did it first in 2002 and then they do it again 10 years later to see whether all the recommendations have been taken on board. And I think when we got together for the forum that Glenn held with it was through the ACDC programme, and we were all saying, yeah, there does need to be this best practice guideline created. I feel like a lot of performers, they don't feel the support because they might be performing as individuals. They'll go and do cabaret or they'll go to a festival and it's just an individual. And you have that protection when you're in a group and when you're in a company and there's or maybe not, but maybe you have a better chance if there's a great director, I don't know. But I think there's even less protection when you are an individual and then you turn up to a venue and then they say, oh, that's where you're going to rig, and you're like, what? So I think that could be the great starting place to come up with that guideline of best practice. And then if you are a performing venue and you want circus performers to come and perform for you, then you have to meet these requirements or recommendations. And I don't think anything like that is in existence at the moment.
Circus Strada, which is an European network, is working on a thing like this right now. And Circus Next, which is another European program, they're working on this type of documents on a European scale, which obviously is very complicated.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Edel.
Thank you. Thank you.